20 minutes to discuss very complex questions of geopolitics. But a fantastic couple of speakers for this last session today. Let me remind you the title of today's forum, Resilience, Risk and Reinvention, the Asia-Pacific in a Splintering World. And I'd highlight, and this is, sorry, it's a bad news piece here, that we are in a splintering world. We're in a world where the normal rules and structures of international relations, of economics, are changing very rapidly. And so we've seen that in the last few years with an increase in interstate violence. A Russian invasion of Ukraine that actually began 12 years ago with the annexation of Crimea and has really picked up in the last 4 years following the most recent incursion. Steve, you were serving at that time as US ambassador to Poland, one of the frontline states in NATO's eastern flank. I'd like to start with you giving us a few minutes on the geopolitical implications of both the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the current conflict in the Middle East, especially on how that's impacting Europe's perceptions of geopolitics.
Well, thanks, Michael. And I would just like to start off by thanking Shirley Lin and her superb team at CAPRI for organizing this conference. It's great to be back in Taipei. The world is splintering, but I find Taipei to be a beacon of hope. I know that may sound funny as we debate the various challenges that Taiwan faces, but I think there's a lot of good news here, and it's good to be reminded of that. Certainly, the conflicts in Ukraine and the current war in the Middle East have had a dramatic impact on the geopolitical situation. But at least as important is the role of the United States under the leadership of Donald Trump and how he has pursued U.S. policy in both of those conflicts. Certainly his, I think, ill-considered decision to start the war in Iran on February 28th, his abandonment of Ukraine just weeks into his second administration, his open flirtation with Vladimir Putin, his threats to seize Greenland from Denmark, his questioning of Canadian sovereignty, his national security policy, which identified social and cultural issues in Europe at least as an important a threat to the United States as the rivalry with China. So all of these taken together, the trade wars that have been a hallmark of his administration, have really caused an enormous doubt. Love him or hate him, he is the most consequential U.S. president in my lifetime, and we're trying to figure out what the implications of his policies will be. Certainly, immediately, NATO is facing its most serious crisis in 77 years of a very successful history as the most successful alliance of the modern era. People doubt the credibility of the United States to supply its security guarantee to Europe. That, in turn, has diminished U.S. deterrence, not only in Europe, but throughout the world, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. Soft power, American soft power, is really in serious deficit. Working at the University of Virginia, every day I confront the challenges of heightened immigration barriers to attracting some of the world's best and brightest students to American shores. That has an impact. In Iran, in the Persian Gulf, the U.S. is arguably in worse strategic position than it was before the current war started. Iran is, despite not changing regimes, Iran now is governed by a more radical regime. The United States is facing this with, other than Israel, no real ally support. The damage done to the Persian Gulf energy infrastructure and the Persian Gulf economies has been incredibly consequential. The basis, I mean, the Persian Gulf allies with where we have had bases for many years are now quite causing them to question, is the United States presence threat or protection. So, and in the meantime, Iran still possesses the highly enriched uranium, possibly capably a few weeks away from a bomb. And then there's the world energy crisis, the biggest disruption to energy in the modern era. So it sounds pretty depressing, but it's not all bad. The Trump administration's policies have served as a wake-up call to Europe that it's time to basically get serious about providing for its defense and defending its neighborhood. And that's been dramatically true in Ukraine, which is an inspiration. The fact that they have survived the Russian onslaught for now more than 12 years, as you pointed out, is really remarkable. And they are now producing all sorts of drones. They're really redefining the future of warfare. And this has also accelerated a move away from fossil fuels. So that too is something to be encouraged.
Thanks, Steve. Matt, I'm going to ask you the same question. Maybe you'll also react to some of the things that Steve has just put on the table here. But when you were serving in the White House as Deputy National Security Advisor, you're obviously thinking about these things, briefing the president on these things during the first Trump administration. Talk us through the geopolitical implications of these current crises and these current conflicts for the stability of peace and security in Asia Pacific, the relationships that the United States has with its allies in this part of the world.
Yeah, so in many ways it feels like this might be the most consequential year in geopolitics since 1989. And Ambassador Mull, you spent several tours in Poland, including as ambassador. 89 started as what looked like a normal year, right? Things were sort of stabilizing between President Reagan and Gorbachev. President Bush was sworn in early 1989. It seemed like things were going to be stable. Next thing you know, there was the Solidarity movement achieving success in Poland in terms of negotiating for a partially free election for the first time in decades. And that inspired student demonstrators in Beijing soon after that. And you had the Tiananmen Square protests put down violently, of course, in the Tiananmen massacre. But in Europe, the spark that was lit led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Immense changes. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union was gone. 2 years after that, you had the birth of the European Union. 2 years after that, the World Trade Organization. So it's hard to know what trajectory we're on right now. We are facing multiple wars, as we discussed. President Trump, I think, believed that he could affect regime change in Iran. Historically, you can't bring about regime change through air power. You have to put hundreds of thousands, if not more, soldiers on the ground to do that kind of a thing, and I don't think there's any appetite in the United States for that. So we're probably in a much longer kind of a conflict in the Middle East now than people were bargaining for. Ukraine has been a very long conflict, more than a decade. But where I'm hopeful is that now that the stakes are so starkly laid out, it leads to a greater sense of seriousness. In Europe, you're starting to see more spending on defense than we've seen really at any point, certainly since the end of the Cold War. Japan is now doubling and perhaps even is going to triple its defense spending. Here in Taiwan, you have a major debate going on as we sit here about defense budgets and how much to increase them by and so forth. So I'm actually optimistic that that Ukraine will survive and win this war. I think that that the regime in Tehran, over a longer period of time, is going to have to face a reckoning with its own people. And I think that Taiwan, the people of Taiwan, as I interact with students and journalists and officials and people in all of the parties, there is a sense, sometimes not expressed publicly, but a sense that Taiwan has to get much more serious about taking its own defense into its hands so that it can negotiate with Beijing from a position of strength. So I'm optimistic that people still treasure their civil liberties, they treasure democracy, they treasure the prosperity that democracy has made possible in ways that ultimately may not lead to a 1989 type direction, but nonetheless, I'm not counting out democracy in the 21st century. I think that ultimately it may be strengthened.
Thanks. We almost certainly agree on all of that. I also remain very optimistic about the prospects for the future. But let's bring the focus down to the near future and ask the question that everybody hates being asked. But Steve, I'm going to come back to you. We seem to be in a situation right now where every day there's a different flavor of the war in the Middle East. Do we have a ceasefire? Is there a blockade?
Several times a day.
Sometimes several times a day. Talk us through the next few months. How do you see? I mean, you were actually working on this issue of the nuclear program for the State Department with Iran. What's your sense of how this unfolds? Is it a matter of weeks? Is it a matter of months? Is this a long-running conflict? Are we going to see the Iran conflict essentially resemble the Ukraine conflict? Is this a decade-long process we're looking at here?
What an easy question you asked. When thinking about the direction of the current conflict, I often think of going back into history. A French police minister, Joseph Forchet, once quoted after Napoleon ordered the kidnapping and execution of a nobleman who was opposing him. And Minister Forchet said, "Oh, this was worse than a crime. It was a mistake." And trying to figure out a way out of what I think was a mistaken decision to go to war is a problem. And as you pointed out, the Trump administration has laid out several different conditions which have often changed, sometimes in the same day. I see there are perhaps 5 scenarios based on what the president has said himself since this conflict began. One is that Iran just gives up and caves. Well, I don't think that's a realistic option. I mean, I think the U.S. and others in the region have been surprised by the staying power of the Iranian regime. Another scenario is that President Trump just declares victory, walks away, leaves the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, leaves that for other people to solve. I don't think that is a politically popular outcome. I think now that President Trump is committed to somehow sorting this problem out, I think walking away isn't going to be an option for him. The third option is resumption of full war. But I think for the reasons that Matt suggested, that involves inevitably escalation, putting more troops on the ground in an election year. That's not very popular. I think there could be a negotiated compromise between the United States and Iran, affecting the Strait of Hormuz, affecting the nuclear program. Just yesterday, President Trump said that we're just days away from a possible agreement. I don't think that that's very likely. The nuclear question is very complicated. The JCPOA took almost 2 years to negotiate, and Iran feels emboldened by its position. It feels like it has drawn to a stalemate with the United States, and Trump is projecting an image that he wants to finish this as soon as possible. And so I think that has the impact of making the Iranians harder line in terms of their demands of what they would want to see an agreement to feature. So I think that leaves the last option of the current scenario, the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz with dual blockades, the Iranians blocking and we blocking the Iranians. And it's basically come down to a contest between us and Iran, who has a higher tolerance for pain. I saw reports today of an intelligence assessment from the United States that Iran could survive without incurring significant economic pain for at least 3 more months. Whether President Trump has the stomach to take 3 more months of rising gas prices as the elections draw nearer, I think is open to question. But I think that's the most realistic outcome. Now, that does open the possibility for another power to step in to try and resolve the Strait of Hormuz issue. Europe or China could, I think most people in the world would welcome another power stepping in and trying to broker a solution. And what that could be is an agreement that tolls still need to be paid to transit the Strait of Hormuz, but not to Iran, but to rather a collection of all of the states, the littoral states, in the Persian Gulf, and then use that as a fund to pay for reconstruction. So I think that's the most hopeful outcome. After a time, it's not acceptable to have international waterways you have to pay a toll to get through them. So after time, if that is a final outcome, that ultimately should be removed and restored free passage.
Quick follow-up on that. Which external power would Iran positively respond to? If you play out your scenario of an EU-driven or a China-driven resolution, will Tehran accept that?
Well, I think Tehran would prefer China, given its closer relationship. But I think Europe has now suffered enough distance from the United States in all of this that I think it would have certainly more credibility than the U.S. would have.
Can I ask that same question of you, Matt? I mean, you've been tracking China's leadership for a long time. Do you think it's in China's interests to push a resolution for the current conflict in the Middle East? Or does China actually benefit from having the United States bogged down in order to achieve other objectives that Beijing is trying to achieve?
Yes.
Expand on that,
Both
please.
things are true. I think Beijing is uneasy with a war that, if it goes on long enough, could have pretty significant shock effects on the Chinese economy. Beijing has the world's famously largest strategic petroleum reserves, but they're not bottomless. And so at the same time, Beijing would like to see an outcome that weakens American prestige and power. And so Beijing's doing both things at once. I think they're trying to nudge things towards reopening Hormuz, even as they send weapons and targeting intelligence to Iran to try to sink American warships and the like. So both things are true. I think Beijing is very concerned, though, because Beijing pursued a strategy in the Middle East that was not unlike the American pre-1979 strategy in the Middle East. Before 1979, before the revolution that led to this horrific regime in Iran, the U.S. had a 3-pillar strategy of good relations with Israel, good relations with the Arab states, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and also good relations with Tehran. And after that, it became a 2-pillar strategy. Beijing long cultivated a 3-pillar strategy. Beijing now has terrible relations with Israel because Beijing backed Hamas, the terrorist organization that did its worst, killing more than 1,000 civilians in Israel in October of 2023. Beijing provided propaganda support through TikTok, provided diplomatic cover for them. So that's now in tatters. If the regime in Tehran falls, they're going to be in an even worse position than the U.S. was back in 1979. So I think Beijing's nervous. I think they're a bit anxious about how things are proceeding right now.
Okay.
I think this war could go on for a long time. In the Middle East, wars sometimes never really end. They kind of go hot and then cool again. You could argue that this war began in 1979 when Tehran declared that it was going to wipe Israel off the map and then go after the Great Satan, as they called it, the United States. And this is a regime that gunned down 40,000 of its own civilians earlier this year. So I don't think we can predict what the ultimate fate is going to be for this regime.
But it sounds like both of you are in a position that there's no real plausible short-term resolution here. We're talking about a period of months before.
I would be amazed if Tehran agrees to negotiate away its enrichment program. I hope that happens, but I've seen nothing to suggest that they'd be willing to do that. So I think in some form or another, whether it's cooler or hotter, this conflict will continue.
Would you agree on the nuclear piece, Steve?
I do agree. For whatever reason, some people plausibly suggest that Iran clings to enrichment program because it wants to build a nuclear weapon. Others suggest there are historic reasons going back to Iran's relationships with the French. They gave the French $1 billion to supply enriched uranium fuel for their nuclear nuclear energy program. And then after 1979, French kept the money and didn't provide any fuel. And so, who knows? There are certainly people in Iran, more so now, who want a nuclear weapon because they see what happens to you if you don't have a nuclear weapon. But I think they have decided that they believe they have a right to enrich. The United States doesn't recognize that right, but they have identified that as a core national priority, and they're willing to endure a lot of pain to stick to it.
Thanks. Matt, I'm going to come back to you for a related question. Again, put yourself in the mind of Xi Jinping for a moment. You're in Beijing. You're looking at this war in Ukraine for the last 4 years during this more intense phase. You're looking at the current conflict in the Middle East. To what extent does Xi Jinping take advantage, or what lessons does he draw from these current conflicts in terms of how he's thinking about Chinese coercion against Taiwan?
I think there's some good evidence that Xi Jinping was surprised and concerned by how badly Russia performed in the intensive phase of its war launched in February 2022, right? You remember when many months after the war began, Vladimir Putin sat down with Xi Jinping and the camera was rolling. And Vladimir Putin said, "I know you've got lots of concerns," right? And then the camera got pushed out. I think the concerns were not that Vladimir Putin was waging war on his neighbor. That was always part of the plan. Beijing was in on that, right? They signed a no-limits pact right on the eve of the full-blown invasion of Ukraine. I think we can safely assume that Xi Jinping was concerned with how badly the war was going for Russia, and that's still true today. This should give Taiwan some confidence, because in 2 wars now against superpowers, the middling states are holding their own. In the case of Ukraine, whose prospects look so bad that the U.S. government shut down its embassy in Kiev and asked the president of Ukraine, "Hey, do you want us to give you safe harbor in the United States?" And he said, "No, I'm going to fight." And here we are more than 4 years later, and they're incredibly, Ukraine is protecting the entirety of the Western Hemisphere right now, right? Europe and the United States, with their bravery and innovation and grit. So the Russian Navy was sent, a big part of it was sent to the bottom of the Black Sea by Ukrainians who basically did remote-controlled jet skis with explosives, strapped to these things. And then you look in the case of Iran. Iran has kept the United States Navy more or less far from the Persian Gulf. The U.S. is only in a few cases in the last 10 weeks has the U.S. dared to transit the Strait of Hormuz because of the threat of these asymmetric weapons, drones, on-the-sea drones, undersea drones, coastal defense cruise missiles. These things are not that expensive, right? But this should give Taiwan some confidence because all of these new technologies favor defenders, right? It doesn't favor aggressors. It favors the defender. And if two superpower navies have been kept at bay, that should be good news for Taiwan. But only if Taiwan actually spends the money, does the work, invites Ukrainian and other experts to come to Taiwan and show them how to build a capacity to build these drones and missiles and cruise missiles and the like. The United States is not that power. It's actually Ukraine. Ukraine this year is going to build 12 million drones. 12 million drones this year. The entire United States, for both commercial and military use, might make 300,000 drones this year. So your friends are these other powers that have now proven that they can defend themselves against superpowers. Iran is not one of those, but you can still learn some things from the Iranians at a distance. I wouldn't invite them here.
Thanks, Matt. We don't have a lot of time left, so let me ask a final question, and you can kind of have the last words here. Steve, I'm going to start with you, and then Matt. And I want to bring us back again to the theme of the conference here today. You've already started to take us down this pathway a little bit, Matt. What are the lessons that each of you would give to national leaders from the current geopolitical context that we're in about how to prepare their countries, their societies for these potential existential challenges that might come in the years ahead? Steve, I'll start with you.
Well, the lesson number one is the world is obviously a much more dangerous and unpredictable place. So it's incumbent upon every national leader, whatever their size or geographic location, to worry about their own defense. And to use, Matt's example of Ukraine is absolutely right. To use innovation, to use all of the tools of a modern society to develop a flexible, a coherent defense policy to defend, and then supplement that with developing an interlocking web with similar countries in your neighborhood, with friends with similar interests. Taiwan has parlayed its strength in chip in semiconductors remarkably well, and so I think all of these things are really important for every country to look at. Follow CAPRI. CAPRI's studies and policy recommendations for how to improve resilience is exactly what every society should be doing.
Thank you. Matt?
So one that we discussed, which is that these new technologies favor defenders, right? Taiwan is not dreaming of invading China, right? So this is a time when Taiwan needs to build its own capacity, help from Ukraine, help from Israel, help from countries that now have a proven capability to build layered defensive systems. Another lesson from these two wars is that offensive strike capability is also important, right? The Arab states that were attacked by Iran, even though they hadn't entered the war, yet they were attacked by Iran, all of them. It was Israeli and American offensive strikes that did more to roll back the threat of missiles and drones than as opposed to just relying on interceptors and defensive weapons. So Taiwan should be a porcupine, but one that can, has sharp claws too and long arms. I think also that, again, deterrence means having a capability to defend yourself and also the demonstrated resolve to defend yourself. As people in Taiwan politics are talking about negotiations with China, I don't have any problem with that. But you want to do that from a position of strength. And that means building a defense industrial base in Taiwan that can iterate, innovate, update, and adapt these technologies quickly. The war that's going on in Ukraine, the Ukrainians change their drone technology and their counter-drone technology every few weeks, okay? And Taiwan right now is having these discussions about what do we want to buy in 3 years, right? Taiwan needs to be able to emulate that ecosystem that Ukraine has to be able to update and adapt those technologies rapidly, rather than just relying on large weapons purchases several years in the future.
Great. I'm going to wrap this up by just highlighting a couple of words. The importance of innovation, part of CAPRI's name, and also the importance of working with friends and partners and allies. And on that note, please join me with a round of applause for Stephen Mull and Matt Pottinger.